Goeiedag, good day, fellow South Africans and citizens of the world.
I've been looking around for salvation. I've been looking around for the truth. All around me I see frustration, and I looked all over till I found you. I sit and listen to your stories, and you're telling me, please don't worry. A lot in this world you should know, and love in life is where you should go. If you're looking for somewhere to go, if you're looking for someone to know, if you're looking for someone to guide you, then love in life will guide you.
Goeienaand, good evening, fellow South Africans and citizens of the world. Well, tonight I can tell you this live stream is going to go completely viral, especially in South Africa. The information we're going to be discussing tonight is quite mind-blowing. Now, a few months ago I had a live stream with Jeff Corbinelli about how South African billionaire Anton Rupert played a pivotal role in using huge dormant estates in the government-managed PIC to enrich the ANC elite, and through this process to become the minder of today's government in South Africa. The focus in that live stream was the estate of the A.J. Surtee fortune, and you might recall that. We had that live stream in July. I will actually link it down below this video overnight. That live stream has attracted over 1 million views on Loving Life TV in just a few months. Tonight I'm going to be speaking to another forensic investigator, John D., about how the fortune of another billionaire, Bernard Glazer, was stripped from his family in similar fashion by the Stellenbosch mafia, headed by the Rupert family once again. I'm going to start by publishing a document here dated the 18th of October 1990, and just to whet your appetite, here is a piece of the letter that I will be reading to you in a second. Now, the letter is dated the 18th of October 1990 and penned to J. Malherbe by Jaap Marais, the leader of the Gesigte Nasionale Partij, or HNP. And Jaap Marais was the leader of the HNP from 1977 to his death in 2000. The letter, as you will see very shortly, is headed "The Treason You Allowed." The letter fills in the missing jigsaw piece of how the Rupert family sold out South Africa to the incoming ANC government in exchange for control of the key players like current President Cyril Ramaphosa, who is today a billionaire thanks to these hidden deals done before the white population handed over the country in 1994. These criminal deals were done in secret, and central to their funding were the dormant estates of the A.J. Surtees, Bernard Glazer, and other very, very wealthy estates managed by the PIC after their deaths. Implicated in this letter is the South African Reserve Bank, who looked the other way while the Stellenbosch mafia enriched the ANC elite, including people like Tokyo Sexwali. These documents on the criminal activities of the Rupert family are available in the Loving Life TV forum under the Glazer files. I will ask Nat to put the direct link in the side chat of this live stream. There are dozens of other documents there relating to the Bernard Glazer family fortune, which was stripped bare by the ANC, as well as the Anton and Johan Rupert cabal. The white ruling class in South Africa pre-1994 was sold out by the Broederbond, which was headed by Anton Rupert at the time. Okay, let's have a look at that letter. Here it is. And it reads, to J. Malherbe from Jaap Marais, the treason you allowed. It is also wishful thinking that there were those who tried to convince us to go along with these cash for peace schemes to assist in the greatest sorts of fraud against the very people why has supported our stance on self-determination, and to assist with their wealth to build on a country divided, but in practice one in a model that self-rule could prevail. Now remember, Jaap Marais was Afrikaans speaking. It goes on to say, remember that these 37 top-level members of the ANC will be rewarded with those funds that was taken off the Reserve Bank and that of Lesotho and now named Namibia. It will always be on record that these monies that was privately owned but captured inside the Reserve Bank and controlled by the now lameness Broederbond conspirators was a hard-earned Indian community in Lesotho and some in Namibia. Where are these so-called negotiators who hold all these powers to negotiate on behalf of the Boer folk? Why were not one brave enough to openly criticize the new incoming establishments? Why did Barend du Plessis and all the others in that inner circle negotiate in Lusaka, and why did they have these meetings in Lesotho and other parts in Mozambique? Let me be very frank, and to all who have sold out with the blood of our people, and to those who have had nothing and came into the system as multi-millionaires, they did not even own a car. But those who had a battle going and who were on the streets, I can today guarantee that in years to come will still be fighting, but not with the government, but amongst themselves. Because they will find out of these billions that was divided, and it will be a war of corruption. I fully understood the stance of Mr. Omar as he was to take on the justice portfolio in time to come, and it was true of what was expected of him. It would be in his best interest to make sure that none of these criminal elements be prosecuted, but I can tell you, the readers, now that Mr. Boesak will become a scapegoat to them because of what he was aware of and the directions that were ordered by Malherbe and Rupert. The day will come when the very sell-off will be exposed to all, and regarding the bonds that were redistributed and were made to be securities for the people who can't even count to 1,000, but will become millionaires with just a signature from the Reserve Bank president and those government traitors, and of course Trust Bank, Volksgas, Sambo, Sanlam, and the secret investment companies. He goes on to say, and we are now today exposing the missing piece in the jigsaw and the motivation for what you're going to hear tonight about what happened to the Bernard Glazer fortune. Anyway, Jaap Marais goes on to say, I will expose all the meetings and names as recorded. This meeting, which was held on the 1st of August 1990 in Pretoria, was attended by, and you can see the members of the Reserve Bank and, key to this, the members of the Stellenbosch Mafia, including Anton and Johann Rupert. Jaap Marais goes on to say, in summary, the full advance of all parties that have a viable interest in all current operations, as discussed in the follow-up meeting with regards to the actions of the RB or Reserve Bank and other financial institutions who will assist in the full distribution of the assets with the assistance of the Minister and his special advisors on these important matters as agreed to. Please ensure that the bulk of the actual investments be directed to the appropriate banking institutions as agreed on. There should be no leaks and minimum activities announced, and all must seem as normal. Transfer as per orders for the incoming parties. As a matter of great concern to the Lesotho deals and their full cooperation, it must be clear that, now this is where these live streams come in, it must be clear that Mr. A.R. Surti, that's the live stream I had with Jeff Kubanali a few months ago, and Mr. Bernard Glazer, that's tonight's live stream, be treated as to the way we did with the Botswana deals. Now remember, Surti and Bernard Glazer were multi-billionaires, and their estates, after they died, were being held by the PIC, which is where the corruption took place, under the control of the Rupert family. Let's continue with the letter. Once these acts are completed and all the current assets and monies are transferred for safekeeping by the appointed bank, we will then advise all parties of actions taken, and it must be stressed that no paper trails will exist within the new order as agreed with the settlement of leaders. The current stockpiles of precious metals and other valuable stones will be sealed, and the intelligence agents who will set up the companies abroad has been advised to conclude all deals in anticipating the stocks of all the assets. Full amount disclosures will only be discussed at a later stage with the current leadership and the incoming leadership that will be advised and chaired by Mr. Anton Rupert. With the banks being incorporated with the acceptance of Sambo Bank, we will have the new heads of all the bank as advisor, and they will play a very critical role in investments and other future potential deals. The following people will be added, and all documentation must be disposed of as agreed. Mr. Malherbe and Mr. Straden will be delivering all the aspects of the bond investments, and the companies will be set up in conjunction with the Lusaka delegation. And then Jaap Marais, after basically reflecting on what was decided, states, the evils you are engaged in will be exposed for what they are. South Africa has now been sold to the very people we all once called enemies. The people who had put their trust and faith in all of you have now been betrayed, and the dealings behind closed doors with the ANC and all the other so-called freedom movements are just a smokescreen to enrich your bank friends and a good number of political people you have cooperated in all these new dealings that was agreed to in Lusaka. I made my stance very clear to everybody, and I promise all of you that this whole enrichment scheme will be completely unveiled, and the very people who are now the beneficiaries of these so-called group schemes will end up betraying each other. And I can assure all of you that a financial war will be the next great war in this country, and that your newfound friends will turn on all of you. I made it clear with Mr. Gerard de Kock that if he agrees with the agreements, and I knew he would not have bowed to that kind of pressure, then he could also find himself in great danger of being part of the great Reserve Bank theft by the newfound thieves. Little did we know that he would pass away only to be replaced, the very Stals who would then assist in the pure daylight robbery of the very assets from the bank. It was a well thought out plan to have a person in the bank who would direct the assets to the ANC and to organize them a wealth that some had to work for, but what was now a promise to them. The secret deals in monies given to the Sanlam Group and its owners was always going to be the strong source of transfer designed to conceal all the investments for the new dispensation. And I can assure you that these allocations have already been decided on. The gold reserves and other bonds that were allocated to all at the banks, and of course to the Swiss banks for safekeeping, is just a front. And deals that was concluded in Lusaka, and the most important one in Lesotho, where I believe our country was sold. It must be noted that when Bancorp was in trouble, it was always Sanlam who came to its rescue. And now I understand how Sanlam was able to assist because of its financial life it had at the Reserve Bank. I had a straight meeting with Piet Liebenberg, who was assured that he will never be implicated in the current situations at the banks, and that he was to operate and take direct instructions from Anton Rupert. Then Sanlam approached the Reserve Bank for assistance for Bancorp, but that was just to make sure that they had the current finance that they needed to finance the sale of the country to the ANC. Mr. Barnes approved this deal, but he knew this was only a smokescreen to cover the actual amounts that was allocated to Sanlam. These deals have all been concluded and were only printed on certain dates to conceal its actual intentions and the real value of it. Having all these facts based on direct interactions with all of you, and knowing how you are all implicated in a system to steal the very reserves to keep our country going and selling your very souls, I have no choice but to distance myself from all these criminal and evil actions. There will be consequences for you after you give up this country, as I believe that all of you will be dealing in bad faith. There is no truth in these facts of negotiations, and I think it's a system designed to give the bankers and others a chance to take as much as possible from our society and the Reserve Bank. The Broederbond sold out to the very things it has created, and also when Anton tried to distance himself from it, he was in complete control and was at the forefront of the negotiations and all these transactions that will take place. Also, it must be noted that the homelands and all other countries around have had their money invested in the banks, and also those that are holed up in the Reserve Bank will lose it to your newfound partners in the ANC as a token of peace and enrichment to them. Okay, as I say, that letter there is just basically important because it gives you context to where and why the estates of billionaires were looted and where the money went to, which was basically the ANC. And here are some of the key recipients of the money. And this is in another document. Once again, it's in the forum under Loving Life TV. Here are the incoming party ANC members who will take over the investments and other financial benefits as agreed by the full leadership. And you can see the names of 10 people there. This is another document related to that. So what happened here was that money was basically moved from one group of people under a project called Project Hammer and basically handed over to the ANC elite to enrich them. So I'll just play one little, this again is in the documents on the forum. It's just this one paragraph and then we'll get my guest on. It has been decided in principle that the shares and all other deposits will be decided between all parties as agreed by the full leadership. The accumulated amounts and other disposable assets will be listed and will be deposited into the agreed accounts and companies as suggested by the Broederbond delegation, which back then was headed by Anton Rupert. All right, so I think you're now starting to join the dots. And tonight, as I said, my guest is John D. And we're going to be talking about the Glazer fortune, which just basically disappeared into thin air once it was actually held by the PIC. Let's go and let's get John on. Here we go. Hi, John.
Hi, evening, Scott.
How are you, buddy?
I'm okay.
Excellent.
In the darkness with the candles.
Gotta love load shedding, haven't you?
We get used to it. We're resilient in this nation.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, look, John, just to keep you in the loop, I've basically gone through that letter from Jaap Marais to Malherbe, where he spells out the grand deception, and basically what this does is gives a motivation for basically what happened with Bernard Glazer. Now,
right,
we had a live stream about a month ago where we talked about the early stage of what went on in South Africa, including Cecil John Rhodes and the BSAP and all those sort of areas. Do you want to give us a short 10-minute summary of that, just to kick off tonight's live stream?
Okay. The reason we're going back to that period is because Cecil John Rhodes had half a dozen companies under the BSA chartered companies, and there were various companies like the Bechuanaland Mining and Exploration Company, which was the manager of all the BSA companies. 1888, he had another company called Reed's Drift Land and Mining Company. That was 1888. So there was the Tati Company, which is also around that 1890, and so on. Now, the foundation of Rhodes's activity in Southern Africa, or in the colonies, came off the back of the Queen's Charter from Queen Victoria, which in effect gave all authority to a private company to do what they want. And in the Charter, they were very specific about sedition, keeping the tribes apart, keeping the various white people that came to this country for mining, whether it be Russians or Poles or whatever. Keep the parties apart. And Rhodes's whole activity, even when he conquered in that very short space, because he was born 1953, died 1902, so that's 49 years, he basically put the tribes against one another, and that's how he conquered the lands. But his primary objective was mineral rights. That was the bottom line. And in these companies, he vested large tracts of land. Now, for example, when we went into the Glazer acquisitions in the 50s,
Right.
we had to determine what he bought. So we had to reconstruct it all the way from the beginning. In other words, get all the UK company records for, let's say, Bechuanaland from 1888, every company filing, every director, every buyer we did. every social network chart, every subsidiary that was acquired, that was established then. But what did he buy? Let's say in the Bechuanaland case, he bought it in 1953. So in that reconstruction, we determined that there was a secret society. So when he conquered everybody and he put his flag on the Matopos Hills in, when was it, 1888, he ruled the world.
Right.
Literally. And he created the secret society 1890 to 1900. Now, not everybody's familiar with that, because it's a very important component of what is happening today, because we can say, well, Rhodes lived 120 years ago. What has that got to do with South Africa today? Well, it has everything to do with it, because, and globally. And if we go back, the administrators of his state, he had 8 wills, and I think one went to family, one and his partner, who was gay. The other one went for the establishment of Rhodes scholars, and the other 6 were dedicated to this New World Order secret society that would restructure the world over the next 100 years. And this is where we introduce the Protocols of Zion, and then we get to the point where the Balfour Agreement was established in 1914 after his passing. But let's just park that for a moment.
John?
So the main drive, yeah.
I just want to let everybody know that we actually have the Protocols of Zion in the Loving Life TV forum as well. And this includes the history behind the Protocols of Zion. It's not some bullshit document. It's a valid document, and it's the whole basis of what's going on in the world today. Back to you.
There's an incredible book called Waters Flowing Eastward, which really goes into the half of the book is the protocols, and the other half is a description and the lead up to that point. Books that were written around 1935, 1965. You still can get it, The Waters Flowing Eastward.
Right.
Now, what we've got is, maybe 20 years ago, I'm talking about the 90s, if you typed in the Protocols of Zion on the net, your computer would freeze, or it was blasphemed as a conspiracy and all of that bullshit. But today, there are videos that have come out about that whole Zionist plot. So this is not about being anti-Zionist right now. This is just about an historical succession of events, because what is missing in South African history is Glazer.
Yeah.
That's the third force. The ANC referred to white monopoly capital. It's not white monopoly capital. We're talking about capital and control outside of our borders. They love to throw everything onto the Dutchman in this country.
Yeah.
But it's not. It's about a third force that has managed the globe. And if there's a brilliant book which we referenced in the last interview called The Hidden History, The Secret Origins of the First World War by Jerry Doherty and Jim McGregor. And I urge every historian to read that book. And it goes into intense detail how this secret society were the architects of World War I. And millions died. And what was the reasons and the purpose for World War I? It's a whole nother perspective. As we get further into history, we'll find that the same architects were responsible for World War II, and that Hitler was essentially a Rothschild protege and financed by the Rockefeller. So we're talking about when the secret society got going post 1902, after Rhodes's passing. we had the Anglo-American establishment. It was driven. He's 1970, and so we go from there. Now, so Glazer is our entry point into determine, because nobody's ever discussed the succession of Cecil John Rhodes's companies. We all know about the Oppenheimers, we all know about Anglo-American, and we know about the Ruperts, but where does Glazer fit into this whole story?
Right.
Because he's silent. He was murdered in 1984. He's been removed from all history. You cannot find, other than a little bit here and there on the net, other than the Glazer kidnapping or whatever. But what did he buy? So let's just go through it quickly. In 1949, our Glazer was born. He was a Lithuanian Jew, and he wasn't a religious man, but I'm just going to say it now. He was born 1913. By 1949, that makes him 36 years old. He buys the African City Property Trust. It's at a building in downtown Joburg, very Victorian building. And an ACP was registered around 1885 or 1890, around about there. And when Joburg went from a mining town to metropolis, the big boys in London mapped out Joburg. They planned it. Okay. We just have a sip of water, excuse me.
Now, just while you're doing that, John, my understanding is that the actual big blocks of land in Johannesburg also had mining rights attached to them as well as part of the deal.
Well, that's the thing. You see, when we have lots of prospectors, let's say on 3,000 hectares, because the whole development of the Joburg mining boom really covered a 300-kilometer radius around Joburg. But let's just, in the beginning, you might have 3,000 prospectors on 500, hectares kind of thing. And then as the big boys came in, they bought them all up and they consolidated them. And when they laid out Joburg, the buildings were fronts for mineral rights. So a building had tenants. The receiver of revenue would see the income from the tenants, but the building had a mineral right attached to a parcel of land. And when he bought ACP in 1949, his best friend at that time was Jan Herter, who later became the chairman of Volksgas. Volksgas. And Jan Herter went to the board of ACP. Now, there were lots of buildings in the ACP portfolio. So let's leave that one for now. He bailed out of that in 1965, but we'll come back to that. In 1953, he buys the Bechuanaland Mining and Exploration Company. Registered 1888, the manager of all the BSA companies. Now, in our research, we just unraveled the fact that the BSA Northern Territories, or the BSA Northern Copper Company, controlled an area of 1.6 million square miles. It went into liquidation in 1914. It was also an 1889 company around about there. And it went into liquidation around 1914 because there was not a lot of mineral exploration, because we had the First World War and then the Second World War. So there's not a lot of activity in the accounts. But however, it goes under, and Bechuanaland, being the manager, buys it. So that parcel he acquired. And that land stretched from Zambia, northern Rhodesia, parts of Botswana, and into the DRC. So that's just Bechuanaland and all its subsidiaries. And then if we look, you have with you the original purchase of 1953. I've sent it to you. It's about 4 pages, and you will see a whole list of investments that Bechuanaland had, from steamships to tobacco, you name it, they had it. It's about 40 investments that they had. Then in 1955, he buys the Tati company. The Tati territory area was an area in Botswana of about 1.3 million square, 1.3 million square hectares. Am I wrong? Am I right? Somewhere, yeah. That came in with an agreement with the Bamangwatu. The agreement with the BSA Northern Copper Company was an agreement with the Lobengula tribe. So anybody that's done research on roads will know about those agreements as he went north with the tribes. Then in 53 Bechuanaland, 55 Tati. Now the clangor comes in 1957. Rand Mines, anybody that's followed the development of mining in South Africa is very familiar with A.P. Cartwright's analysis of how things went from 1900 to 1965. There's books called The Golden Age and the whole evolvement of Rand Mines and Corner House. Now, that basically managed the whole lot. But it had a holding company which people are not familiar with. It's called Central Mining and Investment Corp. Glazer made a bid for that. There's very little on this historically. Makes a bid for that in 1957, and with the help of the French side of the Rothschilds. There was an accommodation of interest, and he puts Harry, or the Oppenheimers, onto the board to keep the culture of the business. Now you've got a gunslinger, him and his brother, Bernard and Sam, were the two guys that came in. Buy this, and there's an accommodation of interests. And then 1958, there's hardly anything. I only found one article, but then we finally got the microfiche on it. It makes a bid for Lonra, London Rhodesia, 1958.
Right.
59, his brother dies under unusual circumstances, and in the 60s, he consolidates. Now, by that stage, the Commonwealth Office is very pissed off with him, and they start a whole lot of court cases to try and get it back. The Nats come into power in 1961. Right now, we're at a stage where he's now acquired all the major British South Africa companies. The Anglos of this world and all the others are getting on, but then there's a consolidation around 1964 where we get the BSA company, the Central Mining Company, and another one, I'm just trying to think of it right now, form the Chartered Consolidated Company, and they moved back to London. And with about 150 million pounds, there's nothing in Africa that they didn't control. So everything was consolidated in the UK by 1964 in terms of Joburg. And of course, the mining, he was very successful in the Tati area. You have summaries there where we talk about his succession with Tati. And then he goes into a confidential agreement with Seretse Khama in February of 1970. In 1969, the World Bank had already identified the mineral right potential in Botswana. But, you know, at that stage, they were the poorest country in the world. And that's when the doors opened. So in this confidential agreement, Glazer retains all the mineral rights. The mines department today says he handed it back, but that's not the case. And so, so that is the story. That's the fast forward. And then from 1970, which is where we're going today, he starts global expansion. Okay. He moves back to London. He acquires a company called the Siberian Syndicate of 1913. He buys that in 1970, which owned about, I think it is about 11.9% of the original Consolidated Goldfields. Okay, there were two goldfields companies.
Right.
I think one of 1913, one of 1917 with the same name, which owned all, the mineral rights in their territories. They consolidated. They were very close to the Rand Mine stable. And I think most of it was bundled out and went to Hanson PLC in the 80s. However, he owned 11.9%. That got expanded, but he buys the Siberian Syndicate of 1913, which also had a lot of mineral rights in Russia. And he changed the name to Crest International Security. So I think that's kind of the fast forward. We've got the secret society. Somehow and we have Rothschild with all the other boys that Rhodes had on his administrators of his trust. I can go through them, but I don't know if that's really important. But Rothschild was amongst them.
Right.
These were publicly listed companies. So he would have had to have had a sanction from the Rothschilds to buy these companies, and particularly all of them. Number two, the Nats were coming into power. And his best friend, we know it was Jan Herter. So I believe he also got a lot of Broederbond money. Okay, because now he was wedged in between Zionists, because Rhodes was a Zionist, Churchill was a Zionist, right?
Yep.
We know that Rothschild created Israel, 1914. So he was wedged between Zionism and the Broederbond. And basically, the Afrikaners never really forgave the British. After the Jameson raid, without going over that again, and the fact that when they did a deal to stop the bloodshed and bring the Afrikaners back to the table, because Rhodes wanted to have nothing to do with Kruger, nothing. He hated them. But somehow the Union of South Africa came together, and then they went and put them all in concentration camps for 18 months, and they sent them to the far corners of the earth.
Yeah.
Now, lots of their wives were killed, their children were killed, their farms were burnt. So the Afrikaner, particularly the Free State, never really got over that. Never. And so we find that in the history of mining in South Africa, we had the Anglo-American establishment, who were very successful and very empathetic, because miners just want to get on with the business. They helped the government build ISCOR, Arms Corps. They helped the government get the country going. That's miners. I like miners. They just want to get on with the business. But you never found the Anglo-Saxons getting invited to the Union of South Africa and then became the Nationalist Party. So they weren't on the board. You didn't have Oppenheimer in the government, if you know what I mean. It was always the Anglo-Saxons and the Afrikaners. There was always that divide. And you could see it even in the schooling of South Africans. Rhodes had his English schools that he started, the old schools in Cape Town, and the Afrikaners had theirs out at Paarl and elsewhere, and the same in Pretoria. So there was always this subtle divide between the Anglo-Saxons and the Afrikaners. But however, they had the government, and of course, with the whole world being based on gold, etc., after the Second World War, the world had to be rebuilt. Europe was destroyed. And when you have to rebuild, you need a lot of cement.
Right.
So Reed's Drift comes in there because it had 60,000 hectares in the Northern Cape, which produced 60% of the world's lime at the time. So a company in 1970, I think, was formed called Anglo-African Shipping, New York, and that later became Rand Merchant Bank. But that's another story.
Right.
So that was the lime part. But from the gold, you also get, out of the smelting of gold, you get...
uranium.
What's it for nuclear?
Uranium.
Uranium.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the leaders in that charge was Bechtel. So you will find that like those nuclear reactors that leaked in Japan, recently when they had that big tsunami,
yeah,
they were 1970s nuclear reactors, the first generation. And Bechtel, as a private family, were in financial troubles in the 70s. And this is why I'm going to take everything into the 70s in this interview, because I'm of the opinion that the foundation of modern history has its foundation 70 to 75.
Let's talk about
and
that,
Schwab,
John, because I think that is such an important point you just raised. Over to you.
Okay, so Glazer, as I said, is our entry point. What did he create? Because now he's got the government on his side. We know he was very pro the Afrikaner. Very close friends there. He was a man of an African soil. He had his farms called Northern Ranching, but he was also a Masonic. He was a Scottish Mason. There is he donated a hall in Francistown. Okay, so you get the two types of Masons. You get the York Rite and you get the Scottish Masons. Right? Okay, so and it's basically the York Rite from the Rhodes side that basically hijacked everything else. Okay. So as so in 1970, we're now leading up to Kennedy, okay? Because Nixon, well, Kennedy was removed to make way for Nixon. Put it that way.
Right.
So,
In 1970,
so
1973, the Nixon took us off the, or 1971, Nixon took us off the gold
69.
standard.
I think he 69 he came in, yeah.
Yeah.
But Kennedy was murdered in 69.
Right.
And the story there with that movie is well described in a book about Sam Giancana, written by his brother. The book is called Double Cross.
Now, just for the record, Sam Giancana is very, very big in the mafia world, isn't he?
He died in 90. He was murdered. He was also taken out in 75. But he was a protege of. God, no, you'll know the name. Who was the big mafia don in the 30s and 40s? Damn.
Anyway, it doesn't. But Sam Giancana was a mafia guy.
Chicago. Correct.
Yeah. Now, how is he tied up with Glazer?
Well, if we take the what happened was Kennedy's father. I'm going to bring in Glazer just now.
Sure.
Kennedy's father wanted to get his son into business, and it was the Bronfmans who were all part of the bootlegging, and you remember in the Prohibition period in the United States.
Yeah. There
was a period in Canada, then it ended, and then the Bronfmans got going, and you have a document, we can go through that. But
I might actually pull that document up while you're talking, because it just gives people something to read, because we're now talking about Bronfman, and Bronfman was a Zionist, wasn't he?
Yeah. But look, yeah, you're going to open that document. You can describe to your guests. But
okay.
What we're looking at is a plan to put Kennedy into power.
Yeah.
He comes into power, becomes president. I think it's 64, whatever, and then his brother goes to the New York Justice Department and then starts going for organized crime, which obviously didn't fit very well. And Bronfman used the Chicago boys, used Sam Giancana to swing the vote, to get the trade unions to vote for Kennedy. That's how they got him in. Okay,
so you're actually saying that the mafia in the US are able to actually manipulate who gets elected president in America?
Well, Godfather. If you've seen the Godfather series, then you know what I'm talking about.
Yes.
That's what we're talking about. So, the history of that first period in the United States, if we go into the Second World War, you had Lucky Luciano. He was selling contraband in Italy. I mean, the only way the American government could save themselves from getting bombed by German U-boats was to get the docks sorted out. So they had to cut a deal with the mafia because the mafia owned the docks. So they had to do a deal right in the beginning. They've always been part of the entire system. So Bronfman, Sam Giancana, but the reciprocal person in the United States at that time was Meyer Lansky. Meyer Lansky was in New York. Meyer Lansky, let's call him the ultimate accountant. Okay, he was the mob accountant. There were a lot of other superstars within, because they consolidated. Over that period of 4 or 5 decades, there were lots of different gangs, if I want to call it that, business interests, West Coast, East Coast, but they finally amalgamated, consolidated, and they became eventually a global body. Now, coming back to Glazer, he's now starting his expansion in 1970.
Right.
He's got a government behind him, which is a very powerful government, very strong military, but we've also got sanctions. And there was a lot of, so they created a Trojan horse, and I believe that is Glazer. He set up a parallel system. Now, he was highly successful in his own right. He'd somehow worked his way into the Anglo-American establishment in the mining industry. But it's very strange that he's so silent in history. You don't get him in books.
Yeah.
There's hardly anything on him. And when he died in 1984, there's nothing. They, in fact, kept him alive in the Who's Who until 1992. And you have to be kept alive in the Who's Who, you have to do an annual filing. And then he just disappeared, and that whole publication just stopped.
Sorry,
So let's
John,
go
I
back
just want to get back to Bronfman. How does he fit in with Glazer?
Well, so Glazer passes 1984. 1984.
Yeah.
And Bronfman sets up a company called Edper Brasken in 1986. And it then later changed its name to Brasken. Then sets up a mining company called Noranda. And by 1999, it arrived on the scene as the largest mining company in the world. 99. Suddenly just popped up out of the blue.
Wow. Okay.
Now, we were following correspondence that we got out of Glazer's files and others, where his son was Sam. He had a brother called Sam, and he had a son called Sam. Was looking for distressed properties in London, and I've got a little summary there for you called "Follow This." That might be useful to read, because the Canary Wharf at that stage was a distressed property. Okay, and we'd unraveled that Brasken bought it. We thought, no, but that's very strange. And we found that the correspondence in this involved Panama and Glazer accountants and lawyers. So that's how we got to Noranda. So fast track this thing. Noranda comes on the scene. They have a major interest in Falconbridge. So we're looking at the period post Glazer's passing in 1984, where a lot of these areas, like let's just use Botswana as an example, were managed. The mining still had to continue. So you had joint venture agreements with, let's say, Phelps Dodge and Falconbridge. And Falconbridge was a huge international company. So Noranda Brasken has a 60% interest in Falconbridge. It started at 40, went to 60, and then eventually, suddenly, the name changed. They dropped the name Brasken, and it just became Falconbridge. I thought, okay. In 2004, Noranda and some of its assets goes off to the Chinese Min Metals. I think you've got it there. And that parcel goes off to the Chinese. But eventually, Falconbridge is taken over by Exastra. Exastra. I don't know quite always how to say that.
Okay, before we go through that process, just take us back to 1970 and 75,
Sure.
and just tie up, because that's just before Glazer was murdered in 1984. What happened during that period? Because that's, as you say, that's when the gold standard was removed. The world changed. Right. There was all this shit going on in the background. And I think something that people have got to understand who are watching this tonight is that a lot of history that we've been told is BS. What is actually going on is theft, corruption, and fraud at a huge level. And I think this is something we need to focus on. Let's look at that critical period, 1970 up to the death of Glazer in 1984.
Okay. Well, let's go back to that period of Rhodes. All right, just to start there.
Sure.
The Crown Agents for Overseas Governments. People might say, well, are they responsible to the Queen? No. Are they responsible to the UK government? No. But yes, they did liaise a lot with the Commonwealth Office. but they were financed by the Rothschilds. They were an independent, like a foundation, like the Rand Club is, or the Cavalry and Guards Club in London. It's a club of individuals that were managing the colonies. So they had lots of companies.
Right.
So Crown, I'm getting to your point now. I just need you to bring in Crown agents because that's very important.
Go ahead.
Crown agents was a 4 Millbank house on the Thames and had numerous companies like 4 Millbank Investments. If a country was making money, they put their money, they acted as bankers. They owned lots of banks, but they were also involved in procurement. They were involved in expertise. They printed stamps. They printed currency. That's the light stuff. Don't think they weren't involved in arms and other stuff as well.
Right.
Because when Africa decided to go for independence, various countries, ours was 61, Rhodesia was maybe 65, blah, blah, all the way up Africa. They were declaring independence from Britain. So the Bank of England created 13 tax havens. And you will find that whole structure of what happened in the 60s in a wonderful documentary called The Spider's Web. It's on YouTube. That will explain it all of the turning point 60s and what the Bank of England's plan was with the tax havens. Now, so we've got Crown agents for overseas governments sitting with a lot of cash from colonies, right?
And
remember,
Crown
UK
Crown agents are not a British government thing. It's actually owned by the Rothschilds, isn't it?
Yeah, today it's a foundation, but it was then as well. It went back belly up in August 1974, and that's where I'm coming to, as far as everything else is concerned.
Okay.
So it was after 183 years. So it was there before Rhodes. It was there to manage the colonies. And because coming back, if you look at sorry, if I digress too much, just tell me to pause, all right?
Yeah, no problem.
It's just a thing I have with my co-research, and sometimes we go off at a tangent, we talk too much, and then we go down a rabbit hole, and that's not the point. So I won't feel offended if you say pause. if any of your viewers want to say pause, they've had enough to say pause, and I'll stop and I'll turn right.
I just want to remind everybody watching this live stream that if you go to the lovinglifetv.com forum and look at the Glazer files, all the documents I'm showing tonight are available there. It's a huge resource, basically confirming what we're talking about tonight. Back to you.
Yeah, the one that they probably want to read is a fast forward. Look, it's not a fast forward, but it's the shortest summary I could do. It's about 20 or 30 pages. Is a brief history of Bernard Glazer. There I try and capture everything.
Yeah.
In one document. Because to reconstruct history over 100 years, it's like picking up every shell on the beach and trying to give it shape and form.
Yeah, sure.
There's lots of interlocking relationships and so on. Anyway, so Crown Agents is there. So let's go back. So we've got this organization. Now, we've also got, on the back end of all of this, the casino business started. Because remember...
Now that
organized crime.
That was mafia money, wasn't it?
Well, let's put it this way. The casino business started throughout the United States. We had Las Vegas.
I'm talking about Sun International and Sol Kersner for Putuswana.
Correct. So that came afterwards, but I'm just trying to get the foundation. So Glazer invested in all of these. I believe it's Glazer that put Kersner in business.
Right.
Because we also see him involved in Crest. We see him involved with Ladbrokes. That's a very big organization. But let's just go back. So we've got organized crime. I have a lot of respect for them. Let me say that. But anyway, you've got Las Vegas. You've got what was that place? Jersey, just outside of New York. There's a book about resorts called something on the Boardwalk. It's about the birth of Resorts International. So in 1970, he gives his nephew, Dennis Baleka, $1 million, which is a lot of money there, to go and invest. And they set up a company in New Jersey called Summit. And they take that money, and before Resorts had that name, it was called Mary Carter Paint. And of course, the Christians in Africa, I'm talking about, were heavily involved with it as well. And so you had organized crime and you had the origins of the Christians. It's that three-letter word, let's just use that description. Involved in cash, laundering of money.
Right.
Because essentially what had happened, when we get to the Vietnam War, and we're going to bring the story current, but the United States, with the Vietnam War, had incurred a lot of debt. And of the top 20 industrialized nations of the West, I think the top 20, could be the top 10. Anyway, they were 100 billion in debt, the top 10. Of that, the United States was 80% of that. So at that period, the money in circulation wasn't more than 50 billion globally. Right. So the United States had to get out of this hole.
Right.
And what better funnel than the crown agents? Because the money is going to flow through them because they're doing investments on behalf of the colonies. So they're holding cash. They're holding mining money. Because remember, mines need hydroelectric power. They need all sorts of things. The countries needed infrastructure. So the crown agents were the ones that built it. Yeah, even in South Africa in the 70s. A lot of the buildings on the roads in the Southern Cape and the bridges were built by the crown agents. The electrical stuff, whatever happened. So they held a large pool of money. And with the casino, then the casino business started in London. And a lot of the directors got intimately involved, got into debt, and that was the way organized crime controlled them. So organized crime used the crown agents to funnel cash. Now, it didn't matter whether the drugs came in from South America. Miami was basically a central point, and we know about the story with Cuba as well. That's where Mylensky was intimately involved with his friends.
Right.
It was Cuba. They had the whole resort story going there. But let's get back to the Vietnam War. So airplanes go in with arms, Air America. What comes out? Opium. Opium gets recycled. You got it. Who's going to handle it? Organized crime. So we have the laundromat of the Bahamas, because that was also tax-free haven. And once you've laundered the cash, what do? You buy treasuries. Treasuries act as collateral, and the Swiss banks, because crime agents also owned a lot of banks, and so did organized crime. Now, this takes a lot of synergy. Birds of a feather flock together. And now we're entering a point where, in the 1970s, where the Trojan horses, I call it Volkskas International, but it comes under the summary called Coptic. Coptic has a subsidiary, just to fast track it, called E. Schwab. Nothing to do with World Economic Forum guy.
Right.
E. Schwab. It's a merchant bank, not a big one, but a banking license was rare in those days. And particularly for the South African government, how do you get a banking license in the city? That's only a square mile. How do you get a banking license? Okay. Now, remember, UK they're a nation of shopkeepers. They can convert stuff. But where does everything come from? It comes from Africa. And Glazer was Mr. Minerals. He had bought the whole pile. It was just a question about development. So, E.S. Schwab changed his name and becomes Volkskas International. Okay.
Now that's
And
the
there's
same.
Hawkscuss
Sorry,
International London.
that's the same Volkskas that had banking branches all over South Africa back in the 1970s.
Yeah. Right. You had Volkskas South Africa, but you had Volkskas International,
Right,
which was 100% owned by Coptic.
and that's
And Glazer, I
Glazer.
think, had a 25.
Yeah,
He had a 25% share of Coptic.
right.
So we can pull up that summary just now. I just wanted to give your audience a quick fast forward, and then we can maybe dive in down a rabbit hole here and there.
Right.
So we've got Crown agents in London managing huge amounts of funds. We've got Sam Giancana in Chicago.
The mafia boss.
We've got Meyer Lansky, the ultimate Don accountant.
Right.
He managed everything. Meyer Lansky was a 10%, just a 10%er. The guys that got wiped out were the guys that got too greedy, wanted more. If you look at the history of Las Vegas and stuff,
Right.
they wanted more. The Buckley Seagulls of the world, they wanted to control and stuff. They're the ones that got wiped out eventually. But he somehow survived everything as a 10% in everything. And it was Meyer that used the Crown agents to buy treasuries. Okay. So you had a company called Formal Bank Investments, but you also had a company called Formal Bank Nominees. So I've got paper where it would say the registered signatory is, I'm just going to use that name, David Green, for Formal Bank Nominees for Resorts International, because they also had an account with the Crown agents. Okay. So we've got resorts in the US, we've got resorts in the UK, and of course they went global. And we're sitting with a situation now. Nixon comes into power, and there's a huge debt. Even New York was struggling in those days. I mean, everything was broke. Okay. And they had to come up with a different kind of plan. So the big picture story on this one is the rules and regulations for a Pacific bond series were written in March of 1973 for a bond issue that went from the 15th of May 1975 to the 15th of May 2005. So at that stage, the United Treasury was looking for about, they advertised for 750 million, but they issued 1.6 billion. And that was to determine the purchase price and the interest rate, which was finalized at 8.25%. But what in effect had happened, this was now, the rules and regulations were printed. So if they were printed for this bond series in March of 1973, it had to have been planned as early as 1969. So what really happened was at that stage, the world was currencies were backed by gold. So if South Africa owed the UK money, they would just ship a whole lot of gold to them. Well, the UK called in on the US. They didn't have enough gold to pay their debt, so they had a meeting at Camp David. They said, fuck the gold standard, and we got to come up with a substitute, which was treasuries, which is essentially an IOU.
Right.
But to make it attractive, they issued these physically engraved certificates, physically engraved gold certificates. I mean, it had coupon chips attached to it. So if you'd laundered $10 million and you bought these bonds, you got just a 10 million piece of paper, okay? And you can collect your interest annually, or you can use that bond to pledge or to loan against or do whatever. Mm. And the bonds came out in bearer, registered non-transferable. So if you bought a bond for your daughter and you didn't want her husband to get it, you'd say registered in her name but non-transferable. If it was bearer, which was the most popular bond, you had piles of the stuff. So the bond series is planned 73, but something happened. Now, in the meantime, Bechtel's in financial trouble. The nuclear reactors are leaking. It's a private family run out of San Francisco. they've got a problem. So George Shultz gets onto the board of, becomes the United States Secretary of Treasury. And if you read the book by John Loftus and Mark Ahrens, The War Against the Jews, or whatever, it talks about that Middle Eastern conflict, which started with a boat. I can't remember the entire story, but they blamed it on the Palestinians, and then you had that whole shit show go down with the Middle Eastern war around that period.
Right.
Okay. What resulted then was a quadrupling of the oil price. Okay. So if the oil was $10 a barrel, it went up to 45. I think it went up 5 times, but they always talk quadruple, so I'll just use that. Now, what happened with that was the quadrupling of the oil price meant a country like South Africa would have to borrow to get oil in. Well, at that point we had sanctions. So let's enter Mark Rich, which is Rich and Co. He was the forerunner of Glencore, but let's just Mark Rich enter that fray.
Right.
So, so the South African government would have to pay a premium to get oil into South Africa. So it would have to borrow money, and there were 6 banks that were lenders for the OPEC nations. 4 in the US, 1 in London, 1 in Europe. They became primary lenders, and that was essentially the birth of the debt system, the sovereign debt system as we know it. So what had happened was, when they quadrupled the oil price, the OPEC nations as a collective went $140 billion in surplus. Remember, I said to you, the total money in circulation was $250 billion.
Right.
The United States and 10 other richest countries were $100 billion in debt. And I think the United States was 90 of that 100. Right. So the Bilderberg Group, 5 people, took that 140 that was a surplus, and moved it back to the United States and plugged their hole. So when Ford came into power, the hole had been plugged. There were 90 billion in debt, and 140 billion comes in. So what had happened was, in the bigger scheme of things, Bechtel got a construction job for the building of Riyadh, because we're entering the issue now of Sharia law. They're not allowed to get interest.
Right.
Muslims.
Yeah.
So it's an exchange for goods and stuff. So Riyadh was built from 1975 to 1995, $140 billion construction job, and they built it out of the sand. Now, who were behind all of this was the Crown agents as well. Of course, don't think the British weren't involved, and so on and so forth. So that saved the United States, saved the Western economy, but essentially the rest of the world had to pay for that premium. So we built Riyadh.
Now, I just want to interrupt you here, John, because we're talking about the global financial system, and I think that's something that we could talk for hours about. I'd like to get back to Glazer. Okay, so now you mentioned you mentioned earlier that Glazer basically had all these mining rights, and you've just talked now about Mark Rich, who was one of the founders of what is today the world's biggest mining company, Glencore. Do you want to take us through how those mining rights, which belonged to Glazer, which was a substantial part of his assets, were just disappeared and landed up somewhere else? Because this also ties up with what we're talking about here, with his estate being kept at the PIC in South Africa, which is managed by the ANC, and how that was pilfered to actually pay off the ANC elite. If you can put those bits together for us.
Sure. So I was just giving you the macro environment in terms of, because something happened I'll come to South Africa in a second. In 1974, the the Crown in August 1974, the Crown agents for overseas governments collapsed because of a whole lot of skullduggery,
Right.
after 140 years. The Texas Commerce Bank collapsed. The British Israeli Bank collapsed. Nixon resigned, all in August 1974. So a lot of parties that were involved in getting these bonds, it became unclaimed accounts because they weren't invited to the party. It was meant to be a government-to-government issue. That's the issue here with these unclaimed bonds.
Right.
So from a South African perspective, we've got Glazer now fronting, and I don't want to use the word fronting because that's speculation. He was highly successful with the Tati gold mines. The first gold mines was not Joburg, it was the Tati gold mines. Monarch and those, Phoenix and all of those mines were there before the Russian Joburg. So he was already successful there. And other interests that he bought in Zimbabwe.
Right.
But with the Sharpeville crisis and the Soweto risings and so on and so forth, the Bruno Bond formed a group called the Enlightened Action Group, a whole lot of professors and academics and blah. And it was a plan to bring the ANC into power, a 20-year plan. So we go from 73 to 1994, right?
All right.
It was a plan because they could see the trouble coming down the hill, the population was unhappy, blah, 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 and big business. And South Africa was on steroids because we had the gold standard, and we were the largest miners in the world, and that's not only in gold, but it was also in chrome and other metals. And by virtue of the fact that every major holding company was based in Joburg, because it all came off this Rhodes pile of mineral rights.
Yes.
Might have been different companies, they might have broken up into different sections, but in terms of policy, birds of a feather will always stick together. So you will always find the same bankers, the same lawyers, the same players, the same miners, all doing the same thing. They just bounce from one entity to the next. It's a club. It's a very small world.
Mm-hmm.
And the Enlightened Action Group had this plan to bring the ANC into power. Now, it's not, again, we're going back to the whole process of Rhodes's world where you always divide and conquer, okay? And the British were masters at financing a terrorist in the bush. That's where Tiny Rowland comes in.
Right.
And so was Mossad. If you want to bring somebody into power, you create a mess and you'll finance and bring somebody into power. That's really what happened. I mean, the ANC was broke. They were being financed by the Russians, okay? And it was the Cold War. We must never forget there was a Cold War. So essentially South Africa, inverted commas, was on the side of the West. So our intelligence agencies worked with their intelligence agencies, but the whites were a minority tribe. And that's the problem we had in Rhodesia as well. There were 250,000 white South African, or not Rhodesians, and 4 million black Rhodesians, but two different tribes.
Right.
So, with the independence in the 60s, the plan in South Africa was to bring the ANC into power. And Glazer obviously didn't want to go ahead with certain things, and this is where I was bringing Schwab. Okay, but so we've got the Nats coming into power in 1961, and I'm going to take it to 1994. How many years is that? That's whatever.
33.
Right. But it was, by F.W. de Klerk was there already sorting a yes or no vote in 1989. P.W., you've got that video clip where he says that Mandela is the decoy dove.
Yes.
Because P.W. was fighting globalism already. If you look at his earlier videos and commentaries, he talks about globalists. And at that stage, Citibank.
But even Verwoerd talked about globalists as well.
Correct.
Yeah, back to you.
So they didn't, and there was still this underlying. Anyway, so they made a plan, but so did the big mining boys. They were going to not leave everything here for the ANC. They were going to take it out. So in the African City Property Trust, they bundled all the mineral rights into the Marshalltown Syndicate, which was 571, and they left this country for 1,000 rand.
Which would have impoverished South Africa tremendously.
Well, they took the guts out. I mean, Gencor came in. There's a wonderful book called Through Fortress and Rock, which is where the Afrikaners were given an entree into the mining world by the establishment, the Anglo-American establishment.
Right.
So in downtown Joburg, you had the Rand Club, and then they formed the New Club, which was basically, you had to be invited into the Rand Club, but anybody else could go to the New Club.
Yeah.
And Gencor, Through Fortress and Rock, is an incredible story of how the Afrikaners finally got into the mining business. They have a great success story. And what ended up in London was called Gencor ACP. And then it was farmed out again, and so on and so forth. So but there was just so many parcels, whether you're talking DRC, whether you're talking Zimbabwe, whether you're talking Botswana, there's a lot of parcels. And Glazer never wanted to be seen to be owning everything, because he didn't just confine himself to Tati. He bought a lot of stuff in the south. And we can see that in the various companies. Yeah?
No, just on that particular issue, there's a term called the Great Dyke, which is the richest mineral resource on the planet. And it's basically
correct.
What it is Zimbabwe and Zambia are the spine with ribs of this great dike of rich mineral resources.
Correct.
Fanning out into Botswana, the DRC and northern territories of South Africa, Tanganyika, where rubies
correct.
are found. Do you want to just take us through how this is central to the mining rights situation?
Well, if you've got to look at the Geoscience Institute and look at the maps on, before these guys carved up the borders of, because, I think it was around the turn of the century that the British and the French got together and they carved up Africa and decided which territories are going to be what. That's why you've got a situation in the Middle East where you've got a minority ruling, like Sunnis might be a minority ruling the Shiites, or vice versa in Iran. So it was carved up, and then they did their borders and so on. But if you look at the Geoscience Institute and you look at the maps, then you can see the mineral formations underneath ground, the geological formations. And so the Great Dyke is the richest repository in the world. In fact, Zimbabwe today is the richest country in the world. Of 214 countries and territories, Zimbabwe is the richest. So how come all the money's offshore and there's nothing here? That's the bottom line. Then coming back to this Enlightened Action Group. So Glazer clearly was not keen, because he vested his global estate, his global assets in a South African trust. Yes, he had a Panamanian operating company, which facilitated loans to South Africa at the time of sanctions. Cool. But essentially, he vested his entire estate under South African jurisdiction in the master's office in Pretoria. Okay.
Yep.
Global, which this government let out for 250 million rand, bottom line, in November of 2005. So even with all the evidence on the mineral rights, even with everything, they still let it out. So we're talking about who put the ANC into power and who within the ANC camp went the globalist route.
Right.
Or were bribed, or whatever the case may be. And we're looking at a situation where, let's go back to the US. Schwab was Kissinger's protege. He set up his World Economic Forum as early as 1973. And so this country has also got captured by globalists, because they put the ANC into power. So whoever cut this deal already had a 20-year plan to take everything out. But you might say, okay, well, that's money in waiting. South Africans used to say, well, our money's offshore, and it was everyone for themselves. And that's what happened. We were actually double-crossed by members of the Broederbond as well. The population, this rainbow nation, was just a ruse. It was the greatest marketing effort of the century, but it was a ruse. That's why PW called Mandela the decoy dove.
Yeah.
It was a ruse, and serves one term, and the current government has hung on that shirt tails now for, what's it, 39 years? Built nothing, stolen everything, and just gutted the carcass that was left, basically.
Well, okay, let's look at one very specific aspect to this, because it really is the core of what we're talking about. And that is
Right.
With that document which was penned by Jaap Marais, where he talks about how Glazer and Surti basically had their estates, because they had both died, so their estates were tied up with the PIC, how they basically had their estates plundered by the Rupert family, who then paid out the ANC elite. That was basically the funding used to buy the ANC and put them in the camp of the Stellenbosch mafia. Do you want to just go through that and include the mineral rights, how they were moved? Yeah, back to you.
1985, okay, so Glazer dies 1984, 1985, 1986, 87. We've got Citibank calling in on its loans. The country needed money fast. So that was facilitated. And and Glazer had huge funds. Now, Jeff knows a lot more about this in terms of the Glazer funds that were that part. I can talk about mineral rights and the bankers.
Let's talk about the mineral rights.
Well, in the real estate parcel, which I talked about, which you have a summary of, I call it the invisible asset. Okay, because it can move. There was always an agreement. If we look at some of the historical documents, there was, let's say he owned 10% of all the mineral rights in Botswana, hypothetically, okay, particularly the Tati area. There was a deal on average of about 50% or sometimes 60%, where it was split with the BSA chartered company. So it was like a 50-50 split. It varies in certain areas, depending, I think, on what you're going to do in that area. Maybe it'd be 70-30, but on average, let's say 50% each way would be a split on the mineral rights, which is still a substantial sum of money. And through that, you can bribe any government. Because in the case of Zimbabwe, the question is who put Mugabe into business? That's the other thing. In Mugabe's case, he says all mineral rights vest in the president. But what he really did was he ceded it to the Zimbabwe Mining and Development Corporation, which ran a parallel banking operation out of Bahamas, and nothing came back in. So whatever deal Mugabe caught, and he was a very wealthy man, and he built railways and did all sorts of things, they also put him into power. And the same thing with the ANC. So the sad part about all of this is they had everything. They had the motivation, and they had the DNA of South Africa. We saw that in the World Cup of 1995. South Africa was tired of sanctions.
Yeah.
Tired. We'd had it. We'd been blackballed around the world. At times we couldn't travel. We struggled to get visas and all of that nonsense. You know what I mean? Now we were liberated, and everybody wanted to go with the Rainbow Nation. Well, now the pillage started, because those that were at the top of the totem pole in the ANC cabal, alongside the associates that were in the Broederbond side, which at the end of the day will bring in the British. Because at the end of the day, you have to control the mineral resource supply out of Africa. Bottom line, there's nothing in the UK but a nation of shopkeepers. Okay, so you have to control it in one way or another. And the way you do that is you create sovereign debt. So the arms deal is an example of sovereign debt. The more sovereign debt you can give a country, like in South Africa, we've gone from 20% of GDP now to 88%. But the more debt you give, what do you exchange? You do a cession of mineral rights as collateral. So if we take Lonhro, if the Glazer estate closed in November of 2005, Oppenheimer leaves South Africa in January of 2006. Anglo Gold reversed into Ashanti in Tanzania, the goldfields there. When I say reversed, it was brilliant what the mining guys did. So I'm not against anybody for what they did. They just took the lay of the land. This was Africa, and you operated. And Lonhro was the first to get its old order mineral rights. Now, which basically included, as one of the oldest mining houses in Africa, included the platinum belt. Okay. And then we know about Marikana and what happened there. But by bringing in the black diamonds, because they were referred to as the black diamonds in South Africa, but in Russia they were called oligarchs. Mm-hmm. And the New World Order, World Economic Forum, all of that agenda, both South Africa and Russia were hurriedly brought into the New World Order in the mid-90s. Because the wall only came down in 89, Russia was also impoverished, and they used the very same treasury bonds that I spoke to you about to go and raid Russia for 10 cents in the dollar. And with a lot of these unclaimed bonds over the last 30 years, 75 to 2005, economic hitmen were able to collapse countries and buy them up for 10 cents or for nominal values. And this is where we are today.
Yeah.
Because every state-owned entity is now dysfunctional, and it's broke, and it's been stolen, and it's been gutted, and whatever's gone down, that's fine. That's one subject. But now somebody's going to come in and do what they did in Hungary, and they're going to do what they did in Russia. They're going to come and buy it up for 10 cents on the dollar, and then you're going to wake up one morning and you're going to be sleeping with the enemy. Now, will it be the Chinese, or will it be whoever? Could it be whatever? It doesn't really matter right now. But that's the plan. But by ceding mineral rights, and when Mugabe used to run out of money in terms of balancing his payments, he would cede mineral rights to Credit Suisse. Now, Credit Suisse from the 50s was always Glazer's security holder.
Right.
So you will find in the financials of Exastra or Glencore, you're always going to have Credit Suisse somewhere. Now, and then you would have also Standard Bank nominees. You would have all, your bankers. So what they were able to do is most of these companies that operated in these areas had prospecting rights. The prospectuses that you get are always very vague about the mineral rights succession. Nobody likes to ever talk about that, because you hand these parcels out. It's like with Brett Kebble when he set up Durban Roodepoort Deep. They know what the mineral resources in that ground. Okay, so he sets up the company for 130 million, and maybe he gets a huge loan from Investec or ABSA or whatever, and he paid out R1 billion to the ANC Youth League. $1 billion in those days when he got going, because his father had been an old mining boy.
Yeah.
So the resource part of Africa and the globe has always been the ultimate prize. We've now got a mining boom on our northern borders in Zambia, Rhodesia, or Zimbabwe now, DRC. I mean, Tanzania. It's cooking. Okay, why is South Africa not happening? It's because simply in 2006, now that the estate was closed, there was a legal action by a whole lot of lawyers, and you've got a document there which I've sent you, that said to the government, if you don't hand back these mineral rights, investors that have got shares in our companies will sue us, and we're going to sue you for hundreds of billions. So they got 6,000 mineral rights back. That's another parcel that left.
Now just sorry,
Sure.
There's one piece of the jigsaw puzzle missing here, and that is that those mineral rights were part of the estate of Bernard Glazer in the PIC. Correct. And Glazer died in 1984. He had 3 kids. Sam Glazer was the one who basically pulled the pin on the will being distributed. But while, as I understand it, while he was at the PIC, the mineral rights, which are huge under the Bernard Glazer fortune, just disappeared.
Correct.
Can you just take us through that? Because, I mean, that to me
Look,
is a key to the whole thing.
in the preparation, because the Botswana government, we use Botswana, and I'm bringing in Botswana, not that we've not done other areas, but I use Botswana because in the preparation, what the Blue File team did was they had to focus on one example, because when Bernard's daughter Michelle, 1/3 beneficiary of the Glazer World Trust, made an application against the trustees and said, you're being economic with the truth, you don't mention mining. She knew that her dad was in mining. Our main focus was not to look at rubber-stamped companies that were wound down for the purposes of finalizing the estate. We had to just find one thing: mineral rights. So if we look at the Botswana Tati concession documents that you've got there, you'll see about 9 pages of just mineral rights.
Right.
Certified copies of the original mineral rights. Those are the numbers. The Blue File team got that evidence. And that's a whole story on its own, how we got it and so on.
Right.
So the same with Zambia and Zimbabwe. We got the original mineral rights registers that Rhodes issued. They're big green books. They're about 1 meter by 1/2 meter, green leather binding. And there are hand-painted areas. And they allocate where these mineral rights are. Because as these areas evolved over time, they put various companies to go on the prospect and do and whatever, because, the bush was there, there was malaria, there was all sorts of things, there was no infrastructure. So the succession of those mineral rights, we were able to build in the first 6 or 7 volumes, which covered Zambia and Zimbabwe, but the territories were greater. So now those mineral rights are part of this estate. And it's his relationship with the Afrikaner and the Broederbond and so on is why because he was very pro-South Africa. Very pro. He loved Africa and he loved it. This is where he made his fortune, but he was a gentleman. He wasn't a rough man. And he put his global estate. He had interests all over the world. I've mentioned Siberia, I've mentioned Russia. But if you look at the Ashbourne summary, they had a substantial interest in the Argentinian land company. And a subsidiary of the Argentinian land company was, I think it's a Patagonian sheep farming company of 1908, which was incredibly profitable. Wool and meat and whatever, very profitable. And they wanted that cash cow. So they might have had a 30% interest, but it was a big parcel in the Ashbourne portfolio.
Right.
So we've got Glazer in London. We've got the Crown agents. Now they collapsed August 74. So we've got the period 70 to August 74. We got Glazer's global operation going from 1970. I mean, I've told you now, he did the deal with Seretse Khama, February 1970. He buys the Siberian Syndicate of 1913 and 1970 with the original 11.9% of the consolidated goldfields. And then there are records missing in Company House from 1913 to 1969, which is strange, but we did get others. So certain records have been removed, but my suspicion that one of the biggest mining houses in the world, which is Norilsk, which comes out of Russia, comes from the Siberian Syndicate of 1913. Now, he changes that name to Crest International Securities. And we see in that whole organogram a relationship with Close Brothers, Ladbrokes, which again brings in the gaming business, property holding companies in Holland, etc., etc. So Coptech was essentially, as I said, the Trojan horse was now to get that banking license, and it has hundreds of subsidiaries, all in alphabetical order, all Pty Limiteds. You get Ashbourne as the industrial company, investment company. It owns things like Chelton Electronics and even owned Quick Fit, people that fix cars and all of that. But, those were just fronts. And then we have the holding company, which was Incentive Holdings. We have to look at the directorships there. Now, both on Coptic and Incentive, we have Lord Mancroft. And this would be a good time to pull up Lord Mancroft's bio, because in all these summaries, we do bios. And we'll see his relationship as a Zionist with Bank Leumi and relationships in Switzerland and so on and so forth. So Glazer managed to work his way through the Anglo-American establishment, all his lieutenants, if I can call them, like Lionel Casper and these guys. I think they were the Hebrew Order of David. They were the guys, they were the gunslingers. They went out there and shot and bought and did. Okay, and they often sat as MDs and directors on companies, with Glazer always being in the background, because that was his modus operandi.
Right.
Was always to be, moving the chessboard in the background, but not being he was not a celebrity. He was a private man, very, very private. He was not a celebrity at all. Okay, drove a humble car, had a place in those days in Morningside, 30 acres. Now it's near Santon City, but then it was 30 acres. And even on that domestic property of his, he registered the mineral rights in the South African Township Board. So the interesting thing also with Glazer was there was nothing on the SARS database about him. Nothing. Nothing.
That's crazy.
So obviously he was, with all the companies. Look, we haven't even dealt with the South African companies. There were hundreds. Okay, right down to funeral parlors. You remember, even when he buys these companies like Tati, he got involved with hydroelectric systems. He got involved with water. He got involved with timber. He got involved in building a town. I mean, that's what mine holding companies do. They build the infrastructure.
Yeah.
So there are lots of companies all the way down to funeral parlors. So he had companies in Zimbabwe, Aberfoyle Holdings. Now, when we dug deep into Aberfoyle Holdings, we found it was registered in 1935. It owned all the tea plantations in Zimbabwe. Nobody ever talks about that, but it was a very big tea producer for the colonies. But it also owned the tea plantations around the world, in Ceylon and other places. So later, when you go forward, you'll see that the Brett Kebbles and Durban Roodepoort Deep were mining in Ceylon on those tea plantations. That's how the empire ran.
Yeah.
So all of this happens between 70 and 84 when he's murdered. I always say he dies under unusual circumstances. But in 1983, he had a very big fight with Donnie Cronje.
That was
I don't know what it was about, but yeah. So whatever shenanigans went down, I'm of the opinion that he went and bought an old Netherlands bank called Insinger. And Insinger was acquired by Investec, I think, in the mid-80s. Now, Investec was registered, and you have a summary on Investec, its entire history, and I salute them.
Now John, I just want to keep that focus on his will and the mining rights disappearing, and the impact that had on obviously the beneficiaries of the will. But the key point that I think we need to really uncover or go down the rabbit hole here with is the fact that the will was actually being managed by the PIC, which is basically managed by the ANC government, and the Ruperts.
No, his will was not managed by those boys.
But wasn't it at the PIC?
No, his will was managed by originally the trustees was Julius Feinstein from the auditing firm Kessel Feinstein.
Yeah.
Which was taken over by Grant Thornton. If you go back into the history of Grant Thornton, you'll see it also started in Chicago.
Okay.
But anyway, and then Glazer couldn't read or write. So right from the beginning, he had his two generals. One was Julius Feinstein, and the other one was Nathan Worksman from the esteemed law firm Worksmans, right?
Right.
When Nathan passed, Cyril Jaffe took over that. And when we look at the directorships of either Nathan Worksman, they're going to like 6-7 pages.
Right.
So that was the expansion of his empire. So, and when he passed, when Michelle instituted legal action, she went against the trustees, which was, at that stage, was Jaffe and Feinstein and Sam Glazer Jr. So whatever deals were done post 1984, because, an accountant and a lawyer are not minors, I mean, Glazer was essentially a mining company.
Essentially, my point, John, is what happened to the mineral rights?
All externalized.
But how?
All out the country.
But there was no benefit to the estate from that.
I can't say what benefit there was or there wasn't. I mean, if we look at the Panamanian holding company, they talk about Credo. And I see recently, who's the guy that does interviews, had an interview with the Credo guys. Their asset portfolio is now worth $350 billion. So Credo came. There were a lot of these older companies were wound down, like Bechuanaland was wound down in '89. A lot of the old guard wound them down, changed names. And it's just like the Y2K2 scenario in 2000. Lonrho became Lonmin. And suddenly you had a whole lot of young South Africans on the board of Lonmin.
Right.
Young ones. 30s. Right. How come within this little cabal, you get the same group, the same parties moving along with the same portfolios? It had to come from somewhere. You cannot tell me when Investec was formed, how do you get an old Rothschild bank like Insigne? It's not possible. Particularly at the apex of sanctions. It just doesn't happen unless these assets get parceled. And an investment bank was created. And we see later that Investec received the royalties. There are lots of articles where in 2006 where Investec was the receiver of the royalties. Where the actual mineral rights went, well, I'm saying they all ended up with Credit Suisse. That's where that's the info I have, is that all these securities were there.
I'll tell you what I'd like to do.
Sure.
I'd just like to go back to the introduction of this live stream where I referred to how the Rupert family basically entered into a deal with the top ANC elite, and the families of Surtee and Glazer are mentioned in there, and that those estates would somehow be used to help fund the ANC elite. Now, that is in this document by Jaap Marais to Malherbe. That's something I'd like to just look at specifically as a wrap-up for this live stream, because we're going to have another one in a week's time. And in that one, what I'd like to do is I'd like to look at where Glazer's mineral rights actually landed up and where they are today. But I don't want to go too broad. So back to that introduction, please spell out to us how that happened.
What happened? Sorry, Scott. Just
okay. Where Jaap Marais says.
Oh, you mean on the Surtee and the Glazer money?
Yes, exactly.
First, I don't see that as a whole parcel. Jeff is the pro on that subject.
Sure.
He's got evidence that I don't have.
Well, tell us what you have.
Look, you've got another 2 documents apart from the one that you've got there, which will show more. I think there was a parcel of 3. If you look into your email, there was that one, and then there were 2 others, which will go into more expansion of this subject.
Right.
Maybe you can just also, we take Glencore right now as an operator. They're not just, they trade, they buy, they sell. They finance mines, an incredible company, but they control the resources in 145 countries. On top of that,
They're the biggest
Disaster
mining
was
house
the
in the world.
resources in 145 countries is what they control.
Yeah, and just
So
from what I understand, it is a large percentage of the mining rights that Glencore own used to be under Glazer.
well, it's obvious. It all comes off this parcel now. You know, you can move a parcel, and you can give authority for this operation or this entity to operate and trade and do and whatever. So somebody's going to be at the top managing this.
And just to be clear, the three beneficiaries of the will or the estate, the Glazer will, are not the ones getting the benefits of those royalties or whatever from the mining rights.
I can't comment on what they got because, first of all, Michelle passed many years back.
Yeah.
Two, I'm not familiar. I think everybody's very comfortable. I know the son moved to San Diego. I mean, if he made a bid for what's that place in London? I said it was a distressed asset. The God, my brain. I think they have more than enough money than they need.
Okay.
There's a daughter that's not involved at all. It's a son and two daughters, but I can't say what they got. I'm sure that at the end of the day, the control would lie in Israel, because we've got the history with Bronfman. We've got with Bronfman and the mega group. They basically are Israel P2I Limited. So if we take the false flag of 1973, right, the quadrupling of the oil price,
Yeah.
Rio gets a construction job, United States gets out of financial trouble, they get the money back, the mobsters move all their cash in, they get a whole lot of bonds, they do whatever they're going to do. A lot of the history has been cleaned up and there are respectable companies today. We're just talking about the dirty stuff in those days, but Glazer was one of those guys like the Anglo-American establishment that were first in. So first in, you get the first parcels. And the rest of the country just feeds off the crumbs, but be that as it may. But the next fault, there was another big false flag, 9/11. What happened there?
Yeah.
And
but
the
I
aftermath
just
of that.
I just want to focus on that one particular area, which is where the allegations are made by Jaap Marais that these estates were going to be used to fund the elite ANC people like Ramaphosa. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, well, in funding the Black Diamonds, I'm going to use that word, right? They didn't have money to start with. So Cyril got the Lonman stable. And we find a pattern in this whole, whether it be Botswana. The government gets 15% shares in the life of the mine.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the black empowerment thing, the same thing. They got a percentage out of what was on the stock market. Right. It's a pattern that I see in everything. There's a 15 or 20% that you give the government of the day, a percentage. It normally just benefits a few, right? And it gets managed, everything gets managed externally. So in bringing the ANC to power, they had every opportunity to ride on the shirt tails of Mandela, harness the DNA of this great country, and build it. But they perpetuated the same narrative that Rhodes did: sedition, keep the people apart, keeping an old communist rhetoric out of Russia, when in fact Russia is a modern society. Putin is going up against the deep state. Him and Trump are going up against the deep state. Okay, they want to clean it all up. What we're seeing today is another false flag. They've got the world going up against one another between Palestinians and Israelis. It's not about that. It's whether we're talking Khazarians, whether we're talking Zionists, whether we're talking... without going into the religious part of it, we've got secret societies that have been prevalent over the last 120 years. And the asset base, the transition from Rhodes went to Glazer. So in the period 1950 to 1983, he was the man.
Right.
What happened post that would be a period from I would say if we do a timeline on this, 1985
Yeah.
to 1994 would be one timeline. Okay, so we had to plug a hole with cash that came in. So maybe, and you've got a photograph of Herter there and Oppenheimer.
Right.
So they arranged for these funds to come and plug a hole because the country needs $35 billion right now. Where's the money going to come from? And then you've got bankers like Fritz Luttweiler, who were at the center of all of this in the beginning, right? Because we had Volkskas International in Geneva as well. So you had the Swiss always in the middle. I mean, it's the Nazis that stole the gold. Where did they put the gold? They put it in Switzerland. And Switzerland paid Rockefeller for the oil that the Nazis got. They've always acted in the middle.
Right.
So, so Fritz, what's his name? Rottweiler or whatever. Geez, names. Facilitated that thing. So in this claim, Jeff knows the money that Glazer had, but I'm not saying it's everything.
Yeah.
I'm just saying it's probably a small portion.
Yeah. Well,
What were the 30s in this whole thing?
We're going to be talking to Jeff next year, doing a follow-up on the live stream we had with him. But look, I'm going to wrap up this live stream because, as I say, we've got another one next week. And that one I'd like to really focus on the mineral rights and their transition from the Glazer estate to these big mining houses and it's just very, very dubious about how all this happened.
Scott, you know how you pick this up is, first of all, you take it in time frames.
Yeah.
What we did was, let's take Botswana. Which areas is Phelps Dodge working on? Which areas is Falconbridge working on? Which other mining companies that were working on certain areas? There was Line Selection Group. There was African Line. There was Russian Selection Trust.
Yeah.
So there were different management companies, and most of them were based, some in Mauritius, holding companies in Australia, but all roads go back to Canada. So if you had a holding company in Canada and it had a holding company in Australia, it was working on a diversified portfolio in various regions around the world, because you're talking about global mining control. That's what you're talking about.
Right.
And if we understand that between Lonhro, Rio Tinto, and Anglo, that's the mother lode.
Right.
And BHP. Broken Hill Properties also came from Zimbabwe originally.
Yeah.
But obviously in the 80s, as most people migrated to Australia, they knew what was coming down because they knew the plan. They knew the plan. They knew the plan was to get everything out. And so they structured holding companies in Australia. But the mining still continued. So as far as a mineral right is concerned, these were just operating companies. They didn't own the mineral rights. Somebody put these same players into business. And you will find, if you read the summaries, you'll find the same, birds of a feather flock together. The same lawyers, the same bankers, the same everything.
And they're all out there to make a quick buck. That's what they're all out to.
Well, that's Africa, eh? I mean, that's what's happened.
Mate,
it's to give it all shape and form. Yeah.
I'm going to wrap up this live stream because we've covered basically that area post 1970 and going right up to 1994. We can just do a summary of that next week again. But next week I really want to focus on what to me is a mother lode, which is the manner in which those mineral rights just seem to have dissipated, and the involvement of Xstrata, Glencore. Just take us through that period. Are you happy with doing that?
Sure. I mean, you remember, Mick Davis and the other Glassenberg were doors apart in Switzerland. It took
Yeah.
11 years to put that Glencore prospectus together in 2011.
Yeah.
Do I think that they've done a brilliant job? Yes, I do. But they were managers.
Yeah.
It's the banks. It's the banks. It's who your major shareholders are. Now you're coming into BlackRock and you're going into this crowd and that crowd. You know, it's how it's evolved. It's where we are today. I mean, but I do have evidence. Well, I don't have evidence, but I have been advised that a lot of these mineral rights were used for collateral trade programs.
Right.
With ANC beneficiaries. So the sad part about all of this is that no one, they didn't take care of the people. They built nothing.
Yeah.
Nobody put a vegetable garden together when there was COVID in a village where people had to sit in an iron shanty. Everything has just been about a small cabal. And that's the sad part about all of this. But how do we unwind it? Well, I don't know how we unwind it. I can only talk about Glazer and his history and the missing bricks in history. That's all I can talk about.
Yeah.
I can give you a pattern. I can give you a pattern. I can't be judge and jury. I'm not God. I can't say, well, this guy's wrong and that guy's wrong. You know, it's all I can do is give you a pattern. But when you spend 30 years on something, you find the patterns.
Now
you follow the money.
That's really, to me, the elephant in the room. That this is a story you've been researching for 30 years. I mean, this is not something you've just picked up in the last 5. This has been your life.
Well, the only reason I introduced Glazer was for no other reason, because I don't get paid for anything. I don't work for anybody.
Yeah.
I'm not writing a book about anything. I'm not working for the Glazers. I'm not doing anything. It's just, in fact, a lot of these summaries were prepared 2004, 2005. Some were refined in 2007. That kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
All I could do was follow the slipstream. That's all I could do. And the day SARS closed this estate in November of 2005, I started preparing, or the team started preparing, Blue File Contagion series, because we knew that was the end. Now that the guts are out, that's why we have 6,600 mines on care today. Nothing's happening. Yeah. Why is nothing happening on those mines? So what was the agenda? Why? Why would the mining boys leave? Well, I know why they left, you know. Why do the Ruperts of this world, well, they say, well, money will only follow, you know, safe places, money flows where it's going to flow. Well, why did we create an environment? In fact, why did we get to the status in the first place?
Right.
I mean, you know, this Rainbow Nation, what? It doesn't make sense to me. And it doesn't make sense to me that we can't just stop the wheel. And I think the part about this is just for those that love this country and love this part of the world to just get some truth. Yeah. And then say, okay, we've got a couple of missing bricks in history. Now we understand what's gone down. We can now understand why Joburg's the mess that it is in today. You know, some things start making sense because the likes of Eskom were created to build an energy model for African operations. Yeah. We were exporters of energy. For mining, everything was about resources and industrialization. So why would you allow something just to collapse and be gutted and destroyed? This to me is all evil. Yeah. It's just evil.
Yeah. Now,
you know, and
John, we've been going for 2 hours, so I'm going to wrap this one up. But look, there's so much to talk about here. So next week we'll get into the specific mining rights area, which I think is the mother lode. I think that's a hugely important area. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Scott. Thanks for having me, and good night to your audience.
Okay, take care, mate. Bye for now.
Take care. Bye. Bye.
All right, guys, that was just another part of the series that we're talking about who was one of the wealthiest men in South Africa. Made Sol Kirstner look like an absolute pauper, and that's Bernard Glazer. And as John makes the point, somehow he's been completely missed out in history, and we're trying to put that straight and try and follow a few dots here. All right, I'm going to wrap this live stream up with Ons vir jou Suid-Afrika, one of his beautiful songs that we play in the wrap-up. And don't forget, tomorrow night, 8 p.m. Johannesburg time, we'll have another live stream and on a very, very different subject, and the rest of the week, the same thing. All right, guys, take care. Have a great evening, and bye for now.
Uit die blou van ons hemel, uit die diepte van ons see, hoor ons ver verlate vlaktes waar die kranse antwoord gee. Ons sal antwoord op jou roepstem, ons sal offer wat jy vraag. Ons sal lewe, ons sal sterwe, ons vir jou Suid-Afrika. Ek wil antwoord op jou roepstem, maar nie offer wat jy vraag. Das bloed op die plase van boere wat hulp vraag. S'nags hoor jy die sirenes, maar jy kyk ander pad. Niks daarvan op TV, net soms in die koerant. Daar's kieme in die water, Eskom gee beerdkrag. Riool stink in die strate, daar's 'n oorlog wat wag. Gery maar op ons paaie, mense maak net wat hulle wil. Arm blankes in kampe, maar jy bly liever stil. Maar is 20 jare later en die beursies is leeg. Studente gooi met klippe en skole lê plat geveeg. Ek sien rye huisies geverf in pink en blou. Regstellende aksie het alles hier verbrou. Maar gate in die paaie bring so streng nie van stryk. Die volk word brandarm en die ANC word ryk. Uit die blou van ons hemel, uit die diepte van ons see, hoor ons ver verlate vlaktes waar die kranse antwoord gee. Ons sal antwoord op jou roepstem, ons sal offer wat jy vraag. Ons sal lewe, ons sal sterwe, ons vir jou